This one. Does that look like just a PowerPoint presentation without all the notes and stuff?
Yes.
Perfect. All right.
Go ahead, Kristyn.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me again today. Happy to be here presenting to our friends at Wahkohtowin Development about Conservation Planning 101. So this sort of follows from the webinar that I'd given back in April, where we touched on a few different elements of conservation, and there was some interest in sort of learning more about how conservation planning looks at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, kind of what's our approach to it, and how that might be able to be adapted for communities for sort of different purposes. So yeah, excited to walk you guys through that today. So for those who don't know me and for those watching online, I'm Kristyn Ferguson, Program Director for the Large Landscapes Program at the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Ontario region. So I have a focus on conserving great, big, beautiful pieces of land, and ideally doing so in partnership with all sorts of different groups, from governments to industry to Indigenous communities, and just really excited to see what potential exists when we kind of all pull together to explore these exciting opportunities. So Conservation Planning 101, and I think I've got a bit of an overview of the Nature Conservancy of Canada here, just a bit of a reminder of sort of how we've worked and where we've worked over time. We've been around for 60 years. Anything in orange is a project where we worked with a partner to assist them in a conservation project. Anything in yellow is an NCC-led conservation project, and I'm excited that these dots up here started recently showing up on these maps. So these are the boreal wildlands properties, a little bit closer to where many of you are today in the sort of Chapleau and northeastern Ontario region. So NCC is always thinking about how can we add more dots to this map? Where are places that we can support efforts? And one way we may do that is through sharing knowledge about things like conservation planning that may be the precursor to things like Indigenous-led conservation areas, etc. So when NCC undertakes planning exercises, it's to help us zero in on what parts of the province we should be focusing our attention on. So our sort of scan of all of Ontario back in 2005, we called it the Conservation Blueprint, and we looked at where are the concentrations of rare communities, rare species, where do we have areas with very high threat, and that really sort of need that conservation attention. And that led us to establish all of these green blobs that you see on the screen here. What we call these are priority natural areas. So those sort of help us to focus our efforts and focus limited resources in on certain areas of the province. And you'll notice a lot of these areas align with where a lot of the population exists in Ontario. And it can just be kind of a helpful guide. So that's something that perhaps you folks may want to think about, sort of like, where would you draw a line around an area? Where's the area of interest? Is it a traditional territory? Is it a certain subset of that where there's key cultural values or otherwise? I just find that that line on a map can really help you zoom in on kind of what's most important. That'll vary from group to group. So conservation planning helps focus. We can't do everything, and that's true for NCC as a conservation organization. It's true for governments. It's certainly true for communities. I know there's so many competing priorities on your plates at all times. So kind of triaging and saying, like, what's the most important thing we can do with these sort of limited resources so we can invest our time and our money in the most effective way to kind of carry out conservation plans in the areas where perhaps they're needed most. Planning can be really helpful when it's informed by the best available knowledge, and it can actually flag for you, oh, I went to do a plan for this area and I didn't have all the information I need. So somebody needs to go out and do a study about X, Y, or Z so we can get the data we need, or we need to have conversations with elders so we can learn about where these certain cultural or historical values are. So planning can almost trigger looking for the best available knowledge or gathering together the best available data to inform conservation plans. And then the hope is that plans are useful and that they don't just sit on this shelf, but instead drive work, improve efficiency, and then let us be sort of adaptive and kind of learn and improve things as we go. And I like a plan as something that you can hold up and say, this is what matters most to us. I think in any sort of negotiation or conversation, NCC is always happy to have our natural area conservation plan to say, see, this area is important. This is why. These particular areas are important. This is why. And it really is like a good basis. So if you're thinking about applying for grants or that sort of thing, those plans can be really powerful tools. And conservation plans can take all sorts of forms. I have to give credit to my colleague Vari McFarland, by the way. These are all her photographs, and this is adapted from some slides she made about sort of just a general conservation planning overview. But yeah, she did some travels up north and took all these incredible pictures. So yeah, Vari and I were talking about how conservation plans will look different depending on where you are in the world or what your purposes are. But the common thread they share is helping understand the most important places to protect. And at the same time, when you identify what's most important to protect, you identify what is maybe less sensitive or less culturally or historically important, where development could happen, be the least damaging. Because I think we can all agree that some level of development is necessary and important. However, it's all about doing it in the right way and especially in the right places. And then any conservation plan that's established could, like I said, potentially be the precursor to a community sort of working to declare an Indigenous-led protected or conserved area, or an IPCA, and then making contributions to those national 30% of lands and waters protected by 2030 targets, or other goals that communities may have for conservation independent of that. So I mentioned we did this sort of like a high level blueprint assessment. That's where you look at a huge area and try and figure out kind of where do you have kind of almost hotspots of conservation or cultural interest on the landscape. And then at NCC, we drill down and then we call it a natural area. So I'll show you an example from the Great Northern Clay Belt Natural Area up in the Boreal. And then from that, you can drill down even further. So if you're managing specific tracts of land, you may have very specific actions to undertake on those lands. And in our world, we kind of call those like stewardship conservation plans. And I think planning is nice because it does provide this sort of consistency over time, but allows you to be flexible. So a plan never has to be written in stone. It's today, this is our best guess at what's important to protect. But we learned this, in year 2. So in year 3, we rewrote the plan and reincorporated these sorts of things. So I think that flexibility is really nice. And here at NCC, as I mentioned, we sort of do this like landscape plan, the Natural Area Conservation Plan, or the NACP, if you can bear with an acronym, bear with me for an acronym. As well as then a property management plan, which gets down to that really fine scale. So within the Great Northern Clay Belt, NCC conserved the boreal wildlands, and now we have a property management plan for those. And I'll walk you through kind of some of the key elements of what goes into those plans. They sort of follow this set formula, and there's a lot of international materials available to help define these areas of planning, which I'd be happy to provide further links and resources to. I used to spend a lot of my time when I started my career about 15 years ago deep in these international materials of like, okay, what's a target and what's a threat and how do I define an action? So I'll walk you guys through some of those high level elements right now. And if anyone has questions at any point, don't hesitate to put up a team's hand. Happy to answer as we go. So really a target is a defined unit of biodiversity with specific conservation needs. So all that means is what's out there on the landscape. What do you see when you look around? Forests, rivers, wetlands, and maybe in some landscapes, there's certain species that need more than just habitat conservation. They need other considerations like roads restored for caribou, for example. So you might put woodland caribou as a target to specifically say in the boreal wildlands area. We did pull it out as a target because it is such a significant species at risk in that area. You can also group species together. So if there's something that's really important, so yeah, you might have just say moose, or you may have like wide ranging mammals for moose and caribou and other things that kind of use these big areas. The question is what's important to you to protect and conserve? What's important to your community, culturally, ecologically, for harvesting reasons, whatever it may be. And then threats are the specific things that can impair your targets. So we identified all the targets, the beautiful, wonderful, happy things on the landscape. What are the pieces that are making those things unhappy? So when I think of a threat to a wetland habitat, I don't know if you guys know the grass common reed, or it's called Phragmites. It's a nasty invasive species that can really get into wetlands and take over. So that often comes out as a threat in our plans, especially in southern Ontario. To a river, you might have dams as a threat or pollutants being discharged into the river. So now you've sort of gone through and identified all the issues that all your targets are facing. So you're kind of painting a picture of what is going on in your defined boundary. So first the targets, then what's threatening them, and then start to think about what do you want to see for that area. This is when you get to be really lofty and dream big and think about what are your goals for your natural area. Do you want to restore several 100-hectare blocks of forests? Do you want to ensure that you have connected forests to provide habitat for moose? Do you want to create I wrote this one, a contiguous 100-kilometer corridor of protected areas to allow for species movement? I really liked that. And that's kind of nice about goals. You can use science, but also use like your visioning to create this vision for what you want the area in your conservation plan to achieve. And then actions are the really fun part, where you get to take from those goals, kind of draw out of them specific actions that would allow you to achieve those goals. And when you think of actions, think about how do we protect those beautiful targets, rivers, wetlands, forests? How do we address those nasty threats, things like the Phragmites in the wetlands or the pollutants? And it's a chance to kind of be bold, but be realistic. Dream a little bit more. Apparently conservation planning is just about dreaming. I didn't think I would use that word several times, but it really is kind of, if you could do anything and you had any amount of money and any amount of resources, what would you do on a landscape? And basically, I like the idea of including everything. And Vari, my colleague, wrote in, including an action to update your plan so you make sure it stays nice and fresh. And then doing a budget where you assign costs to each action can really help ground your plan in reality. So it makes your action sort of fall into that category that they call a SMART action. So it's specific and measurable and time linked. Now you've got a budget line for it. How much is it going to cost to get it done? So you can start to realistically budget for it. Or when you're applying to grants, you have sort of those numbers to pull from. And then having ideas as to different ways that those actions can be funded is great. Though I got to say, my funding plans always look like a bit of dreaming because it's always funny. And you guys know how funding just kind of ends up cobbled together over time. But if there's specific funders, that are interested in specific types of actions that are in your plan, always just great to kind of tag it to, again, make your plan sort of come to life and get grounded in reality. And then all these things can be refined as your plan and your project evolve. So nothing's ever static in time, but it's nice to have a plan to refer to sort of get a sense of where you started and where you want to go. And I like this note from Vari: plans are no good unless they're implemented. So I guess that's fair. Writing the plan is one thing, but doing the plan is another. Certain actions will be more urgent than others, but it's important to take the time to get them right. You won't be able to implement every action in a conservation plan, but it's always good to dream big and write them all down. And I do find that making a work plan with specific timelines, like this action is going to be done by this person by this date, and really having it assigned to people can be really helpful to get the plan done. At NCC, we have a lot of plans floating around at all times, and it's a lot to keep track of. So if you can kind of assign yourself certain actions and say, this year I'm going to focus in on this, it helps, sort of bring things to reality. And I just wanted to give an example of a conservation plan that we've done recently, sort of in your general area. You can see Chapleau on the map down here. NCC's been working to conserve property up in this area. And this sort of cloud-looking boundary is roughly the boundary of the clay belt area, which is a unique part of the boreal forest where it used to sit under a big glacial lake bed. So it's quite flat, quite wet, quite silty. And because of that, it actually experiences unique threats compared to other parts of the boreal. This, as you guys will know, parts of this area are being cleared, having their forest cleared from them and changed into agriculture, which is certainly concerning. So that flagged for NCC that this is a place that maybe we can help and maybe we should be paying a bit more attention. So this conservation context map just shows us where the existing conservation reserves are, the existing provincial parks, some of the towns and roads, just to give us that context of where the heck are we working for this conservation plan. Then if you remember targets, so that's kind of finding all the beautiful stuff on the landscape. Everything green is forest, everything purple is wetland, and all the blue is open water. So those were some of the key targets here. The hatched areas indicate the caribou range. I'd mentioned caribou were a specific target, both for the Boreal Wildlands Property Management Plan and the Great Northern Clay Belt Natural Area Conservation Plan. So again, now we're sort of figuring out, well, where are all these amazing things on the landscape to help us try and figure out where do we want to work? Where do we want to focus in? Where do we know those values are? And how can we most effectively work in this context? And just wanted to give you guys a few examples of some of our targets, threats, and actions from that plan. So I've mentioned the targets a few times, but you just see I get really happy talking about peatlands and caribou. There's just such amazing stuff up there. And some of those threats, like the unique one of agriculture, which is kind of an emerging threat for the boreal forest. Also, existence of old logging roads, which can be quite a problem for caribou, ongoing development, forestry practices, perhaps those maybe more on private land that aren't being done as sustainably. And so some of the actions that came out in this plan were actions to restore roads or keep an eye out for that nasty wetland grass I mentioned, Phragmites, and remove it from wetland habitats or even from roadsides when it's found to make sure it doesn't spread into this area's incredible peatlands and negatively impact them. And connecting people with nature is absolutely key because once people know nature, they understand it, they love it. That's how you really sort of make that connection and bring more people along in this movement of conserving as much land and water as we can in the short amount of time we've got to do it. So I just wanted to touch on how planning is a really wonderful opportunity for collaboration. I think the best plans, the ones where I have time to bring people together, and that isn't always the case. Often we're like rushing to get these plans written quickly to meet certain deadlines, but the best plans are the ones where you can bring together all sorts of different stakeholders, community members and different interest holders and rights holders as a key, all sorts of different types of partners, and get everybody's perspective on what matters. So if you picture that cloud clay belt boundary, what matters to all the different groups within that boundary. That type of collaboration can help you identify the win-win-wins on the landscape. So for me, that might be something like if we hear from communities like Chapleau Cree or Missinaba Cree or Brunswick House, where are the areas of high cultural importance on that landscape? Then maybe NCC is looking at our databases and saying, and where are the high ecological values? And then maybe we hear from the forest industry, we're less interested in this area. And what about where the places where those areas all overlap? That's really the power of collaboration and planning, where you can layer all sorts of different values and kind of then you start to have these hot spots come out of like, this is important to everyone, or in the case of industry, maybe it's less important. And that means this could and should be an area that we focus on because you can't do everything. So it's always good to work in the best and most impactful places first. And plans can really bring together layers of research and data from all sorts of different organizations to help ask and answer the right questions. And planning will show you where your gaps are and say, well, nobody's talked to the elders from this community about the values in this part of the territory in some time. So making a concerted effort to do that and then fill in some of those gaps can make for a more informed plan. So a few questions I just wanted to leave you guys with today. I know a lot of communities have land use plans and sort of different stages of development, and maybe they're not called land use plans in every community, but what are the plans that are kind of already underway? Can those form the base of a conservation plan or a larger, more collaborative plan, like across territories? What data is needed and how can it be best brought in? What sort of resources are needed to actually implement these plans? Or even to create the plans? Is it money or expertise? Is it time and other resources from other organizations? How will the plan get done? And then how will it be implemented? So kind of good things to think about, because I think, again, there's just so much power in planning and showing up to a meeting to say, this is what matters in this area that we care about. And I just think it's a really nice way to underpin those conversations and show that the work and the research has been done. And okay, let's start to actually move towards conserving some of these incredible places. And on that note, I'm excited to keep working together with you all to figure out how we can conserve this incredible part of the world. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today and open it up for discussion or questions.